On a storm-lashed night along the Cornish cliffs, a lone carriage halts at Tregarrow Hall. Eleanor Ashcroft has been sold to a man of ice, Lord Sebastian Blackthorne, to save her young brother in London. The marriage is a contract, the house a fortress of whispers, and behind a sealed wing lies a past scorched by fire. She swears one thing: she will not disappear. Yet the wind carries warnings of a secret ready to break, and of a choice no heart should face, duty or desire. Stay with us as the first door opens. Before we begin, share where you're listening from and tell me what draws you to period romances, the slow burn, the strict rules, or the defiant hearts. Cornwall, southwest England, winter of the year 1821. The wind howled as though mourning the very soul of the land. It whipped across the jagged cliffs and crashed against the stone walls of Tregarrow Hall, a manor built to withstand both sea and man. The sky above was bruised with charcoal clouds, heavy with the promise of rain or judgment. Somewhere in that wind rode the scent of salt and secrets, of memories buried beneath ash and time. In a narrow black carriage, jolting along the uneven path toward the estate, sat Miss Eleanor Ashcroft, her gloved hands folded neatly in her lap, though her fingers trembled beneath the kid leather. Her bonnet, modest and pale, framed a face too young to look so still. She did not cry. She had done that already, in silence behind closed doors, when the papers had been signed and the coin exchanged. The deal had been struck in a parlour that still smelled of tobacco and defeat. Her stepfather, bloated with drink and cowardice, had waved the contract like a victory flag. "He's a man of title," he had slurred. "You should be grateful, girl. A roof, a name, and no prison for your brother." Gratitude. That was what they called the sale of a woman. Eleanor's thoughts drifted, as they often did in recent days, to James, her younger brother. 12 years old, clever beyond his age, and far too delicate for the London slums he'd be left in, alone. The Earl had agreed to pay the debt in full and ensure James's protection, as long as Eleanor became his wife. There had been no proposal, only a transaction. The carriage rocked to a halt. A footman opened the door, and the cold greeted her like a slap. She stepped down onto gravel that crunched beneath her boots, lifting her chin against the gale. Before her loomed Tregarrow Hall, a vast brooding structure of grey stone, its gables sharp, its windows watching. It did not look like a home. It looked like a fortress. 2 servants waited beneath the portico. One was a woman of late middle age, dressed in brown wool and white linen, her cap tied tight beneath her chin. Her eyes, sharp and assessing, softened only slightly when she met Eleanor's gaze. "You must be Lady Blackthorne," the woman said. "I must," Eleanor replied, her voice calm despite the storm inside her. "I am Mrs. Penrose's housekeeper. Welcome to Tregarrow." No other welcome was offered. No husband stood to greet her. Eleanor was led through a vast entrance hall lit by a single chandelier. Shadows clung to the stone floor. Oil lamps flickered along the walls, revealing portraits of solemn ancestors. A fire smouldered in the grate, but the cold had seeped into the very bones of the house. "You'll dine in your rooms," Mrs. Penrose said without apology. "His lordship is occupied." Eleanor nodded once. She did not ask what occupied meant. She would not begin this strange marriage begging for his time. Her bedchamber was on the east side of the house, overlooking a grey, endless sea. The wallpaper was faded but elegant. The fire had been lit. On the dresser sat a folded note in an unfamiliar hand. She opened it. "Lady Ashcroft, your presence fulfills our agreement. I trust you find the accommodations sufficient. There will be no expectation of intimacy, nor of emotional obligation. You are free to conduct yourself with discretion, provided the estate remains in order. My solicitor will provide you with the agreed stipend. There is no need for interaction unless essential." Hess Blackthorne, no signature of warmth, no welcome, no name she could call him. Just a letter, as cold as the stone that bore his name. Eleanor stared at the paper for a long while. Then she folded it carefully and placed it in the drawer. She did not weep. She changed into a gown of dove grey wool, practical for the Cornish winter, and sat before the fire, listening to the wind hammer against the panes. Her mother's cameo brooch lay warm in her palm. She held it as if it could still shield her, still tether her to a gentler world. The Earl had made his terms clear, but Eleanor would make one of her own. She would not disappear. Not within this manor, not within this cold arrangement, not beneath the weight of another man's silence. Whatever storm waited in the days to come, within the house, within him, within herself, she would not let it erase her. Far below the cliffs, the sea roared against the rocks. Inside the room, Eleanor's eyes did not flinch. The morning came not with sunshine, but with mist that wrapped the cliffs like mourning veils. Tregarrow Hall emerged from the fog not as a home, but as a relic, silent, brooding, and watchful. The sea beyond the eastern windows heaved under a blanket of grey sky, and the chimneys exhaled thin smoke into the cold air, like ghosts clearing their throats. Eleanor stood at the window of her bedchamber, wrapped in a shawl the colour of storm clouds. Below her, the grounds stretched in wild and unruly directions, gardens left untended, hedgerows half-trimmed, and paths that led to nowhere. It was as though the house and its land had fallen asleep years ago, and no one had dared to wake them. The gown she wore that morning was one of her few belongings, dove grey wool, high-waisted with a modest fichu tucked neatly at her collar. The brooch at her throat, her mother's, was the only adornment she allowed herself. Practical, silent, uncompromising, like the woman she had vowed to become. Shortly after breakfast, delivered without conversation or acknowledgement, Mrs. Penrose arrived at her door. The housekeeper's voice was brisk, her movements precise. "If you wish to acquaint yourself with the household, milady," she said, "I will accompany you." Eleanor accepted without hesitation. She had no interest in embroidery or idle reading before the fire. If this house would not welcome her, she would force it to respect her. They moved through corridors lined with portraits of unsmiling ancestors, their eyes painted with such cold perfection that Eleanor wondered if Tregarrow had ever known warmth. The walls smelled faintly of beeswax and damp stone. In the stillness, her footsteps echoed louder than they should have. "The East Wing," Mrs. Penrose explained, "holds the main drawing room, the music parlour, and the solarium. They are rarely used. His lordship prefers his study and the library." "And the West Wing?" Eleanor asked, sensing rather than seeing the stiffening in the woman beside her. Mrs. Penrose did not look at her. "It is sealed, my lady. Sealed." The word struck a chill deeper than the morning air. "May I ask why?" After a pause, the housekeeper replied, "Out of respect. His lordship does not speak of it. It has not been opened in nearly 5 years." Eleanor asked nothing more. In the kitchens, she met Cook, a round woman with sleeves rolled to the elbow and flour dusting her forearms like snow. Cook nodded curtly and returned to kneading dough. Beside her, the scullery maids kept their heads low, their eyes flicking toward Eleanor with quick, unreadable glances. The staff did not fear her, but they did not trust her either. She was not one of them, nor was she truly one of the family. She was something in between, a figure who had arrived without ceremony, without affection, and without explanation. By the time they reached the steward's office, Eleanor's senses were sharpened, her spine straightened by the weight of unspoken things. Mrs. Penrose knocked once, then opened the door. "Mr. Hale," she announced, "her ladyship wishes to review the estate accounts." The man who rose from behind the worn mahogany desk was tall and lean, with sun-marked skin, and the posture of a soldier long retired. He bowed, his expression composed, his pale blue eyes direct but not unkind. "My lady," he said, "you are welcome here." "Thank you," Eleanor replied. "I would like to understand the financial workings of the estate." He gestured toward a wooden chair across from him. "You may begin wherever you wish." Over the next hour, Eleanor listened more than she spoke. Mr. Hale explained the ledgers, the rents, the market prices for wool and tin, and the number of hands currently employed on the property. The figures were tidy on the surface, but something beneath them struck her as strange. She noticed inconsistencies. Payments listed under labor that exceeded the number of workers, coin allocated for repairs never completed, names repeated where they shouldn't be. Her brows furrowed, but she said nothing, for now. When she stood to leave, Mr. Hale met her gaze. "You have a quick mind, my lady," he said. "Most would not have seen what you just saw." Eleanor nodded. "Then I trust you will not be surprised if I return tomorrow." He smiled faintly. Not at all. By afternoon, she wandered the library alone. The room was cavernous, its shelves high and rich with volumes left unopened for years. The fire crackled gently, a rare sound of comfort in the house. Outside, the sky had turned to slate. She paused at a shelf marked Estate Law and pulled free a dusty tome. As she opened it, a folded parchment fell from between the pages. She bent to retrieve it. It was a receipt, dated 2 years prior, signed with a name she recognized from the ledgers. She read it twice. The ink had faded, but not enough to erase the evidence. The sum was far larger than necessary for the item listed. Eleanor slipped the receipt into the pocket of her gown. She was not merely the wife of a distant man. She was now the mistress of this household, and she would not allow it to rot from the inside. Later, as evening darkened the corners of the hallways and the oil lamps were lit one by one, she heard the creak of boots behind her. She turned. It was Mr. Hale. "I thought you might appreciate this," he said, handing her a thin volume. A map of the estate, old but still accurate. Eleanor accepted it with quiet gratitude. "You are very kind, Mr. Hale." He hesitated. "The staff, some of them, are uneasy. They remember the last lady of the house." "Lady Isolde," Eleanor said softly. Mr. Hale's eyes flicked upward in surprise. "You've heard the name?" "Only in passing." "Then allow me to offer one thing more than a map, my lady." She met his gaze. "Do not trust all that is silent here. Sometimes silence is more dangerous than speech." Eleanor held his gaze for a moment longer. Then she nodded. That night, she returned to her chamber and locked the door behind her. She sat once again by the fire, the map spread across her lap, the brooch warm against her collarbone. The west wing was marked in red ink, its doors sketched with a cross. Beneath it, someone had written a word in a hand, unlike the rest. Ashes. Eleanor stared at it, unmoving. Outside, the sea battered the cliffs. Inside, Tregarrow whispered, and Eleanor listened. Tregarrow Hall came alive that evening, in a way Eleanor had not yet witnessed. The scent of beeswax and smoke had been replaced by the sharper perfume of fresh pine brought in from the forest to decorate the entrance hall. Silver candlesticks were polished to a gleam, casting soft golden halos across the stone floor. Footmen moved like shadows across corridors, adjusting linens, placing decanters of claret, and preparing a table that stretched the length of the great dining room like a battleground of porcelain and formality. Eleanor stood at the mirror in her chamber, her maid silent behind her. The gown she had chosen, one of the few suitable for such an occasion, was of deep forest green velvet, high-waisted with narrow sleeves and delicate lace at the throat. It was a color that softened the gray in her eyes and darkened the brown of her hair. A single ribbon held her curls in place, and the cameo brooch, as always, rested above her heart. She felt like a figure carved from stone, elegant, composed, and cold to the touch. But within her, the storm was beginning to rise. The invitation had not been extended to her, not by voice or gesture. Mrs. Penrose had simply appeared at her door that morning to say, "His lordship expects you at dinner. 7 o'clock. No explanation, no warmth, only expectation." As the hour neared, Eleanor descended the staircase slowly, her hand grazing the banister, her breath steady but shallow. Voices drifted from the drawing room. Laughter, glasses clinking, the low hum of conversation wrapped in civility. She paused at the threshold. Lord Sebastian Blackthorne stood near the hearth, his back half turned, dressed in a formal tailcoat of midnight blue, with a dark cravat knotted tightly at his throat. His presence was unmistakable, still as a monument, immaculately composed. He turned as she entered, and for the briefest moment, his storm-grey eyes locked onto hers. Something flickered, recognition perhaps, approval perhaps not. "Lady Blackthorne," he said, his voice low and even, "allow me to present our guests." The room was full of unfamiliar faces, neighbours of rank, landowners and merchants trying to appear more than they were. But Eleanor barely noticed them, because standing beside the hearth, smiling with all the ease of a man too practiced in charm, was Julian Blackthorne. "Ah," he said, stepping forward and lifting her gloved hand with exaggerated grace. "So this is the new Countess. My dear cousin has done very well." Eleanor stiffened beneath the weight of his touch. "Julian," Sebastian said coolly, "this is Eleanor Ashcroft, my wife." "Indeed," Julian replied, his smile too white, too smooth. "A pleasure, Lady Blackthorne. I must say, I had not expected someone so—" His eyes drifted over her face, lingering, poised. "Tregaro suits you already." There was something behind his words, something sharp, wrapped in silk. "I trust you've had a pleasant journey from London," Eleanor replied evenly. "Pleasant enough," Julian said, releasing her hand, "though the roads are rough. Still, it was worth the inconvenience to see family, and of course to meet the woman who has brought such transformation to this house." Sebastian said nothing. His gaze had settled on the fire, his jaw tight. Dinner was served shortly thereafter, and Eleanor found herself seated at Sebastian's right, with Julian directly across. The conversation was forced, like dancing on ice that might crack beneath the wrong word. Wine was poured, pheasant carved, courses changed with clockwork precision, but tension wove itself into every space between the words. "So tell us, Lady Blackthorne," Julian said as dessert was placed before them, "what do you make of Cornwall? Quite a change from London, I imagine." "I find it beautiful," Eleanor answered, her fork resting neatly on her plate. "Wild, honest." "Ah," Julian smiled, "so unlike London, or its people." Sebastian's eyes flicked toward his cousin. "I suppose the question is," Julian continued, eyes never leaving Eleanor's, "is it a place for love, or only for arrangements?" The air shifted. Sebastian set down his wineglass with measured control. "That will be enough, Julian." "I meant no harm," Julian replied lightly, "merely musing on the nature of marriage, paper and ink, signatures and silence. But of course, there's more than one way to build a union, isn't there, cousin?" Eleanor's hand curled tightly in her lap beneath the table. After dinner, the guests withdrew to the drawing room. Eleanor stood near the window, the storm outside barely visible in the night. The candles behind her cast her reflection against the glass. Beside the fire, Julian held court, charming the wives with stories of London balls, laughing at his own wit. Sebastian stood apart, a glass in hand, speaking to no one. Eventually the guests took their leave, and the house emptied, its laughter fading like a song remembered too late. Eleanor lingered at the staircase, uncertain whether to speak or retreat. Sebastian's voice came from behind her. "I apologize for my cousin." She turned. He stood at the base of the stairs, his posture rigid, the lines around his mouth deeper than before. "I understand," she said. "He is your guest." "He is a vulture," Sebastian said, his tone clipped. "He smells weakness and circles." "Then perhaps he should have circled elsewhere." His eyes narrowed. "You handled him well." "I do not require your approval," Eleanor replied quietly. Silence. Then, after a long moment, Sebastian stepped closer. "I have never claimed to be kind, Eleanor," he said, "nor warm. You knew what this was." "I did," she said, "but I did not expect indifference." A beat passed. The air between them tightened. "You seem to believe that cruelty is preferable to vulnerability," she continued, "but I wonder, my lord, whether the stone you wear is armor or simply fear." That struck him. She saw it in the way his breath caught, in the flicker of something wounded behind his eyes. "You presume much," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "I presume only what I see." He looked away, as if the fire in the hearth had become more fascinating than her defiance. "You know nothing of me," he said, almost too quietly. "Then show me something real," Eleanor replied. "Anything." But he said nothing. With slow dignity, she turned and ascended the stairs, her steps echoing in the empty hall. At the landing, she paused, half hoping he might call her back. But the silence remained. Behind her, Lord Sebastian Blackthorne stood alone in the flickering light, a man more statue than soul. But Eleanor had seen the fracture, and she knew. Stone cracked long before it shattered. The rain returned to Cornwall with a vengeance, falling in relentless sheets that turned the garden paths to rivers and the cliffs to slippery ledges. The sea below Tregarrow Hall roared with wild defiance, hurling itself at the rocks as though it too sought to break through something that refused to yield. Inside the manor, the wind rattled the windows like a warning no one dared speak aloud. Eleanor sat at the long oak table in the steward's office, sleeves pushed to her elbows, her fingertips stained with ink and dust. Before her lay ledgers, stacked in neat columns, pages fluttering with the movement of her hand and mind. She had not asked permission to return, only informed Mrs. Penrose that she would be attending to the estate accounts for as long as necessary. Mr. Hale had offered no objection. In fact, he had quietly placed a fresh pot of tea by her side that morning and left her alone with the books, as though recognizing in her a resolve that would not be denied. And the books had begun to speak. It was subtle at first. A line here, a payment there. Coin transferred to merchants with no listed goods. Laborers who did not exist. Repairs charged but never made. It was the same handwriting that had appeared in the folded receipt she'd found between the legal volumes in the library. A signature that repeated like a ghost. J. Blackthorne. Julian. Eleanor's mouth tightened. She leaned back in the chair, the weight of her discovery pressing into her spine like a blade. This was more than negligence. It was theft, deception, a deliberate bleeding of the estate for purposes that had nothing to do with Cornwall or its people. London creditors, gambling halls, silk waistcoats and lies wrapped in velvet smiles, and it had all passed unnoticed or unchallenged. She stood slowly, gathering the ledgers into her arms and placing them in a locked drawer. Her heart pounded, not with fear, but with something colder, righteousness. The kind of righteous fury her mother had once spoken of with reverence. The kind that did not shout, but acted. She crossed the corridor and entered the library, where the air still smelled of leather and forgotten knowledge. The map of the estate lay folded on the desk. She opened it once more, tracing her finger toward the one place that had remained untouched since her arrival, the West Wing. The house whispered of it in silence. Servants avoided its mention. Doors creaked with warnings she had refused to hear. But now, Eleanor no longer feared the echo of old grief. She feared only ignorance and the lies it allowed to thrive. That night, when the house had settled into its usual stillness, and not even Julian's laughter echoed from the drawing room, she took a lamp and walked the long corridor alone. The West Wing stood behind a pair of double doors, iron-bound and scarred by heat, long past. The air shifted as she approached, heavy with dust and old fire. She pressed her hand against the wood. It opened without resistance. The hallway beyond was cloaked in darkness. The flame of her lamp trembled. The walls bore soot stains like the fingerprints of ghosts. The wallpaper had peeled in long curls. The floor creaked beneath her boots as she stepped inside. She passed rooms abandoned in the moment of catastrophe. Chairs toppled, drapery scorched, glass cracked from heat. One door stood ajar. Inside, the chamber had once been beautiful. She could feel it beneath the char. The high ceiling with its rosette medallions. The gilt-framed mirror now blackened with smoke, the remnants of a harp, strings melted and broken. and at the far end, partly covered by a burned velvet curtain, hung a portrait. Eleanor approached it slowly. The woman in the painting was young, beautiful, with pale skin and chestnut curls piled high in the fashion of the last decade. Her eyes were dark, her mouth unsmiling but proud. She wore a gown of ivory silk, and at her throat a string of pearls. Lady Isolde Grafton. Eleanor knew it without needing to be told. She stared at the painted face, trying to read in it the story that had ended in ash. A gust of wind stirred behind her. The flame danced. Something slipped from the edge of the frame. A folded sheet of parchment, its edges singed, rested on the floor. Eleanor picked it up with trembling fingers. The handwriting was elegant but hurried, the ink smeared in places, as if the letter had been written in haste or fear. Sebastian, he knows I've found the accounts. I cannot pretend any longer. If I do not speak, this house will rot under his greed. Julian thinks I won't act, but he forgets who I am. He forgets who you are. We have to bring it forward. Whatever happens next, you must not let him destroy everything your family built. The rest had burned away. Eleanor stood frozen, the letter open in her hand, her breath catching. Isolde had known. She had discovered what Eleanor had only now begun to see, and she had intended to expose Julian. On the very night she died. The fire had not simply been tragedy. It had been silence, deliberate, strategic, and final. A sound echoed in the corridor behind her. Eleanor turned, heart leaping. The flame flickered, shadows stretching, but no one stood there. Still, she folded the letter quickly and tucked it into the bodice of her gown. Her skin burned where the parchment rested, as though it carried the heat of the fire still. She left the wing and closed the doors behind her, breath shallow, steps measured. The manor seemed to breathe around her, walls exhaling secrets, floors murmuring truths she now carried like coals. In her chamber, she removed the letter and laid it beside her brooch on the dressing table. Her reflection in the mirror stared back, not frightened, but irrevocably changed. This house had once burned for a reason, and she would not let it burn again. The storm broke at twilight. The sky had darkened steadily since late afternoon, heavy with a quiet menace that neither wind nor thunder dared yet unleash. But when the first bolt of lightning fractured the clouds over the Cornish cliffs, the world beneath it trembled. Rain followed with violent urgency, hammering the windows of Tregarrow Hall, shaking the glass panes as if to demand entry. Eleanor had not intended to return to the West Wing that day. The letter she had found, Lady Isolde's final words, remained locked inside her escritoire, tucked beneath the velvet lining like a sleeping flame. Her thoughts had been a thrum of questions and fury ever since, but fury had no place in a house that rewarded silence. And so, she had spoken to no one. She wandered the corridor alone that evening, her mind unresting, her heart burdened. The lamps flickered from draughts that slid beneath doors like whispers, and the sea roared outside as though mourning something long drowned. She stopped before the doors of the West Wing. There was no reason to go inside, and yet her hand reached for the handle. The wind howled as she stepped across the threshold, lifting the hem of her gown. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and held the lamp higher, casting light across the charred walls and scorched molding. The air was colder here, older, the kind of cold that remembered. The music room, where she had first seen the portrait, still bore the scent of ash and oil paint. Her footsteps were slow, reverent, as if treading on the edge of something sacred and broken. She turned toward the painting again, but it was no longer there. The canvas had been removed. A sharp breath escaped her lips. A shadow moved behind her. She turned, the flame trembling in her grasp. Sebastian stood in the doorway. He was soaked through, rain glistening on the shoulders of his greatcoat, his dark hair plastered to his forehead. His presence was like thunder, heavy, sudden, inevitable. "You shouldn't be here," he said quietly. "I know," she replied just as softly. "But I came anyway." He stepped into the room. The door groaned as it shut behind him. "I moved the portrait," he said after a long silence. "I couldn't bear to see it again." Eleanor did not speak. She watched him instead, the way his eyes avoided the scorched harp, the way his hands remained at his sides, clenched against memory. "She was brave," Eleanor murmured. "Brave enough to speak the truth." He looked up at her sharply. "You found the letter." She nodded once. His jaw tensed. "I should have destroyed it." "But you didn't." The storm cracked above them. The room trembled. Sebastian crossed to the hearth, where no fire had burned in 5 years. His silhouette flickered in the light of her lamp. "She confronted him," he said at last. "That night, Julian, she had found the discrepancies, just as you have." His voice was low but steady, like a man reading a confession he had rewritten 1,000 times. "They argued. I wasn't there. I was with the tenants after the flooding near the mines. I returned late. The wing was already aflame." He exhaled, a sound barely human. "I ran into the fire to find her. I carried her out, but it was too late." Eleanor's throat tightened. "She died before morning, and I—" He glanced down at his gloved hands. "The scars are not just on my skin. I see them," she said gently. His eyes met hers then, and what she saw behind them was not cruelty or stone, but agony. "She died because I failed her," he whispered. "Because I trusted Julian. Because I wasn't there." "No," Eleanor said, stepping closer. "She died because Julian is a coward who feared the truth more than fire." Sebastian closed his eyes, as though her words cut deeper than he could bear. "I haven't touched anyone since," he admitted. "The pain is not just flesh. I can't. My body remembers." Eleanor's lamp rested on a cracked table nearby. She reached forward slowly and set it down, the warm light pooling between them like a breath held still. "Then let me ask you something, my lord," she said, her voice trembling. "Do you believe yourself incapable of feeling, or merely unworthy of it?" He opened his eyes. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice rough. "Proving you wrong," she whispered. And then, slowly, reverently, Eleanor lifted her hand. She reached toward him with a gentleness that did not threaten, that did not demand. Her fingers paused just inches from his. Sebastian did not move, not away, not forward. She waited. And then, with infinite care, she let her fingertips rest atop his gloved hand. He flinched, but he did not retreat. The room around them remained silent, except for the rain and the sound of two hearts aching towards something neither fully understood. His breath was uneven, but his fingers, slowly, shakily, turned beneath hers. Their palms met. It was not passion. It was not fire. It was the stillness after it. When he finally looked up, there were tears in his eyes, but not the kind that fell. The kind that stayed. "I can't give you what you deserve," he said. "My heart, it's too scarred. I wouldn't know how." Eleanor shook her head, tears threatening her own gaze. "I never asked for perfection, only honesty." He drew back slowly, gently releasing her hand, though the echo of her touch lingered. She said nothing more. She stepped away, retrieved the lamp, and left the room as the storm reached its crescendo above them. But behind her, in the room no longer empty, Lord Sebastian Blackthorne remained still, and for the first time in 5 years, he did not feel alone. The snow came in the night, quietly, steadily, without thunder or protest. By morning, the grounds of Tregarrow Hall were blanketed in white, the hedgerows trimmed in frost, the garden statues frozen in mid-breath. The storm had passed, but something heavier lingered in the air, something unspoken, like breath held too long. The village's annual winter gathering was to be held that evening in the manor's old ballroom, a tradition nearly forgotten during years of mourning and neglect. It had been Eleanor's suggestion, softly offered, then quietly arranged with Mrs. Penrose and Mr. Hale. Her intention had been simple, to bring warmth back to a house hollowed by grief. She had not expected Julian Blackthorne to seize it as an opportunity for ruin. By late afternoon, the hall had been swept, the chandeliers lit, and the scent of spiced cider wafted through the corridor like a promise of kindness. Children in woolen mittens chased each other across the gravel, their cheeks flushed red with cold. Inside, musicians tuned their instruments while village women laid platters of meat pies and dried fruit on long tables, their laughter ringing in the stone walls like music from another life. Eleanor stood before her looking-glass, fastening the final pin in her hair. Her gown was of deep plum wool, simple but elegant, the neckline edged with black lace. The color brought out the unusual clarity in her grey-blue eyes. She did not wear jewels. Only her mother's brooch and the quiet strength she had learned to carry like a second skin. At her door, a knock. Not a servant's rap, firmer, measured. She opened it. Sebastian stood there. His coat was dark, his waistcoat charcoal, his cravat crisply knotted, but it was his gaze that startled her, not cold, not guarded, but searching. "You look—" He paused, then added, "right." It was not a compliment. It was something deeper, a recognition. Eleanor inclined her head. "Shall we?" Together they descended the staircase and entered the hall not as strangers nor yet as lovers, but as two people bearing the weight of shared silence. The ballroom shimmered with candlelight. Villagers curtsied and bowed, surprised and slightly awed by their host's presence. Children clung to their mothers' skirts. Elderly men raised their cups in cautious cheer. Laughter mingled with violin chords. For a time, the evening unfolded gently. But then, near the third reel, she arrived. A woman unfamiliar to the village, a guest from London, announced with excessive charm by Julian himself. Miss Arabella Shaw, a known society gossip, her smile painted in scarlet, her feathers taller than the candelabras. She kissed the air beside Eleanor's cheek and murmured, just loud enough to be overheard, "What a fascinating arrangement this household seems to enjoy." Eleanor felt the shift at once. Eyes turned, voices hushed, the air thickened with speculation. Miss Shaw sipped her wine like poison and let words fall like petals dipped in acid. "Oh, but you mustn't mind me. London is full of stories. And your name, well, it dances quite often in conversation. So rare, isn't it, for a gentleman to marry outside his circle, especially one of such silent temperament?" Julian chuckled nearby, feigning embarrassment. Now, Arabella, let us not trouble the lady with our capital gossip." But the damage had been done. The ripple had begun. Whispers bloomed across the room like frost creeping across glass. Eleanor felt her pulse rise, but her posture never faltered. She looked Miss Shaw squarely in the eyes. "I find," she said, voice calm as winter fog, "that gossip only survives where truth dares not speak." Miss Shaw's smile tightened. Julian raised a brow. Sebastian, who had stood silent at Eleanor's side, took a single step forward. "That will be enough," he said, his voice low and final. "My wife is not to be paraded for your amusement." The music stopped. A hush fell. Eleanor placed her hand gently on Sebastian's arm. "I believe," she said, turning toward the musicians, "we were just about to begin the waltz." The violin resumed. Slowly, hesitantly, the hall returned to motion. But the wound had been made. That night, long after the guests had departed and the last candle had been extinguished, Eleanor returned to the drawing room, her body aching from the weight of composure. Sebastian was already there. He sat before the fire, jacket unbuttoned, one leg crossed, a glass of brandy resting on the table beside him. The room glowed with quiet flame and shadows. Without speaking, he poured a second glass. But this time, for the first time, he did so with bare hands. Eleanor's breath caught. He held out the brandy. She accepted it. Their fingers touched. Warmth passed between them like a secret. She sat beside him, the space between them filled with silence, not empty, but full of something almost too fragile to name. For a long moment, they said nothing. Then, in a voice stripped of all defense, Sebastian whispered, "You are not what I expected." Eleanor turned to him, her pulse steady, her throat tight. "And you," he said, eyes fixed on the fire, "are what I needed." She said nothing, because some truths did not require answers. Only breath, only presence. Only the quiet, devastating miracle of being seen. The morning dawned with a deceptive calm, the sky over Tregarrow, the color of wet slate. The sea lay restless beneath it, its surface rippling with the unease of a promise not yet spoken. Seabirds wheeled low over the cliffs, and the wind carried the taste of impending rain. Eleanor stood at her writing desk, the ledgers spread before her like the wings of a great bird in flight. She had risen early, woken not by noise, but by a sensation in her chest, like a thread being tugged in the dark. The estate's accounts had become her sanctuary, its numbers her language of resistance. And it was there, amid ink and silence, that she discovered it. A single line, a sum marked for repairs to the old tin works, dated 2 weeks prior, signed with a name that no longer belonged to any steward or labourer on the estate. The handwriting she now knew well, Julian. But there had been no repairs. The mine had long been abandoned, its beams weakened by time and salt. No work was scheduled and no records matched the payment. And yet, funds had moved, materials had been delivered. Her blood chilled, because Eleanor also knew something else, something Julian had no doubt observed during his time among the villagers. That the children of Tregarrow often used the old structure as shelter when the skies turned cruel. A place to hide from storm, from cold, from home. And the storm was coming. She stood abruptly, overturning the ink bottle. It spilled across the page like a warning, too late. Rain began to fall. She did not call for a carriage. She did not wait for permission. She ran, through the great doors, past the startled footman, down the winding path that cut through the trees and into the moor. Her cloak snapped behind her like a banner. Her boots sank into mud and stone. The wind howled like a beast in her ears, but she did not falter. The rain came harder. By the time she reached the ridge that overlooked the collapsed mining path, her hair clung to her face and her skirts were sodden. But the sight that met her eyes made the cold irrelevant. Smoke, thin and grey, curling from the mouth of the mine like a whisper. She cried out, "Is anyone there?" A voice, small, high-pitched, answered from within. A child. Without hesitation, Eleanor descended the slope, her hands gripping the wet rock for balance, her shoes slipping on the edge of collapse. The wooden beams at the mine's entrance sagged under the weight of time and sabotage. She pushed them aside and ducked into the darkness. The air inside was damp, metallic, filled with the scent of rot and soot. Her lamp had long since gone out. She called again. 2 children, a girl no more than 10, holding her younger brother. Their faces streaked with ash, their eyes wide. "Come," she urged, kneeling. "Quickly." The girl hesitated. The roof. It creaked. Eleanor reached for them, just as a groan echoed above them. The beams, they were about to fall. "Go," she ordered, wrapping the boy in her arms. "Follow the light, now." But just as they turned, a deafening crack split the air. The mine shuddered. A beam collapsed behind them, blocking the exit. Eleanor shielded the boy with her body, her heart pounding like war drums. Then, above the thunder, she heard another sound. Footsteps, heavy, rushed, familiar. "Eleanor!" She turned toward the opening. Sebastian. He stood framed in the smoke and storm, his coat flung wide, his eyes scanning until they locked onto hers. And then, without hesitation, he entered. The man who once flinched at touch. The man who avoided fire as though it could claim him again. The man who had stood for years in the cold halls of his own silence now walked straight into the ruins to reach her. She watched as he stepped over splintered beams, his hands bare, his face slick with rain and sweat and fear. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, kneeling beside her. "No," she said, breathless. "But we must go now." He didn't hesitate. He reached for the boy, cradling him to his chest, and held out his other hand, bare skin, to Eleanor. She took it. It was warm, firm, steady. No tremble, only fire, not of destruction, but of life. Together they guided the children through the rubble, crouched low, breath short. Another beam gave way behind them, but they did not stop. The light from outside grew brighter with every step. The wind howled like a wounded animal, and then, finally, they burst into the open. The children ran toward a gathering crowd of villagers at the ridge, arms outstretched, sobbing. Eleanor collapsed to her knees. Sebastian stood above her, soaked, panting, his hand still outstretched toward her. She looked up. Their eyes met. She took his hand again, not out of fear, not out of necessity, but because something inside her knew she was safe there. He helped her to her feet. Julian was not among the crowd, but his plan had failed. That night, back at Tregarrow Hall, the fire burned high in the hearth. Sebastian sat in silence, his sleeves rolled, a shallow cut on his arm being cleaned by Dr. Merrick. Eleanor stood across the room, watching. He looked at her, fully, without armor. "I didn't think I could," he said softly. "Not again." She stepped forward, took the cloth from the doctor's hand, and finished cleaning the wound herself. "You did," she replied, her touch feather-light. "And you saved more than the children." His eyes searched hers. "You saved me too." The snow had melted, but the earth was still raw with the memory of winter. Tregarrow Hall stood beneath a pale sky, its windows open for the first time in weeks. The scent of wet stone and pine drifted through the corridors, mingling with the faint perfume of beeswax and lemon oil. Servants moved quietly through the house, not with dread, but with purpose, and yet the air held weight, not the weight of weather, but of truth. In the study, beneath the watchful eyes of ancestral portraits, Sebastian stood beside the fireplace, his hand resting on the mantel as though bracing himself against the tide that approached. Before him sat Mr. Hale, his features grave, and beside him Dr. Merrick, hands folded over a thick leather folio, its edges worn from years of caution. On the table between them lay the letter, Isolde's letter, fully recovered. The scorched edges restored with delicate care, every word now visible, every accusation no longer buried in ash. Sebastian did not speak at first. He read it again and again. Then, softly, as if afraid to release it into the room, he said, "She knew. She was ready to reveal him. She died for it," Dr. Merrick added, voice low. "Or rather, for daring to threaten what Julian had built on lies." Mr. Hale shifted forward. "We found additional records, my lord, hidden among the estate's oldest archives, ledgers altered by Julian's hand. He funneled funds for years. The payment to the mine workers before the collapse, falsified. The timber order for repairs that never happened, his, always tied to merchants in London who can no longer be traced." Sebastian closed his eyes. "And the fire?" he asked. "It wasn't deliberate," Hale replied. "But it was no accident either. He overturned a lamp during the argument. In his rage, then fled." Sebastian's voice was barely more than a breath. "And left her there." Dr. Merrick placed a hand on his shoulder, hesitantly, but with feeling. "You did not fail her. You were the only one who tried to save her. I believed for 5 years that her death was mine to carry." He looked up, and for the first time his eyes were not cold, but wounded. What kind of man builds his life on the grave of another's silence? Eleanor stood in the doorway. She had not spoken until now, unwilling to interrupt the reckoning that was unfolding like a storm made of paper and ink. "You're not that man," she said. He turned toward her. He said nothing, but his eyes asked everything. The magistrate arrived before nightfall. His face was pinched with cold and authority, and his coat bore the seal of the county. The evidence was delivered without ceremony. The warrant signed. Julian had vanished. 2 days passed, then 3. Tregarrow Hall braced itself for scandal. The villagers whispered, but not with mockery, with waiting. The tenants who once feared the family's downfall now offered quiet solidarity. A loaf of bread left at the kitchen door, a shawl sewn and gifted without a name, a child's drawing of the tin mine folded and slipped beneath Eleanor's chamber door with the words "Thank you" scrawled in charcoal. But Eleanor no longer felt sure of her place within the house she had helped awaken. She stood before her trunk on the fourth morning, the sky pale behind her, her gloves folded neatly beside her satchel. Her gowns hung limp in the wardrobe, undecided. She ran her fingers across the fabric absently. Behind her, a knock. Sebastian's voice came softly. "May I?" She turned. He stood in the doorway, not as a lord, not as a master, but as a man. "I thought you might," she said, half smiling. He stepped into the room. Her eyes did not flinch. "You've done what is right. You've cleared her name. The estate is safe, the children are safe. There's nothing left to bind me here." He said nothing for a moment. Then, with quiet intensity, he crossed the room and stood before her. "I know what binds you," he said, "and it's not duty." She looked away. "I am not a man who asks easily," he continued, his voice low. "I've spent too long commanding and retreating, giving orders to mask the fact that I was afraid of being seen." Her throat tightened. "But I ask now," he said, "not as your keeper, not as the man who paid for your silence or claimed your name." She turned back to face him, her breath uneven. "I ask as the man who has come to know your strength, your defiance, your kindness." He reached for her hand, bare skin to bare skin. "Will you stay?" he asked. "If I ask as a man." Eleanor's eyes shimmered with tears unshed. "Only if you stay with me, as a man, not a shadow." His fingers tightened around hers. They stood there, bathed in the quiet light of the fireplace, and then, without hesitation, he kissed her. It was not hurried. It was not desperate. It was honest. The way hope is honest when it dares to breathe again. Their hands remained clasped, not as a show of ownership, but of choice. In the stillness that followed, no words were needed, because the past had been named. The truth had been spoken, and for the first time in their shared life, nothing was between them but light. Spring did not arrive in Cornwall with fanfare. It crept in softly, weaving itself between broken branches and frozen soil, coaxing green from grey with a patience only nature possesses. One morning, after a long stretch of chill and silence, the first crocuses bloomed along the southern edge of the Tregarrow Gardens, small, defiant bursts of colour against stone and ruin. Eleanor noticed them before anyone else. She knelt beside them, fingers brushing the delicate petals, and smiled. Life returned not with noise, but with grace. Tregarrow Hall, once sombre and skeletal, had begun to stir from its long sleep. The halls no longer echoed with vacancy. Laughter had returned, quiet at first. Children running along the corridors during lessons, Mrs. Penrose scolding them with half a smile. Cook hummed again while kneading dough. Even the chandeliers seemed to hang differently, as if the house itself had exhaled. The transformation did not happen overnight. It began in small acts. The village school, closed for years, reopened under Eleanor's direction. The children arrived shy and barefoot, some still fearful of punishment or neglect. But soon, ink-stained fingers filled pages with letters, and the sound of reading echoed from stone walls that had not heard joy in too long. Dr. Merrick, moved by the events of the mine and the wounds that came after, volunteered weekly for a new clinic set inside the old post house. With funds redirected from the estate's repaired ledgers, Eleanor ensured that miners no longer chose between food and medicine. Bandages, salves, and warm broth were stocked like treasure. And Sebastian changed too. No one announced it. There was no dramatic declaration or epiphany, but the villagers, long suspicious of the Earl behind the stone walls, began to whisper different stories. That he had mended the roof of a tenant's barn himself. That he had stood knee-deep in freezing seawater to help lift a fishing boat after a storm. That he no longer flinched when a child clung to his leg in thanks. He walked the estate now, not as a ghost, but as a man. He knew the names of the labourers. He asked after their families. He did not speak much, but when he did, the weight of his voice carried kindness instead of command. Eleanor watched him from the windows, from the garden gates, from the village schoolyard. And each time she saw him, She felt it again, the slow thaw of something that once seemed irretrievably frozen. One afternoon, as pale sunlight spilled across the garden walls, a letter arrived addressed in familiar, careful script. She recognized the hand before it was placed in her palm. James. She opened it beneath the pear tree at the edge of the orchard. "Dearest Eleanor, I am safe and well. My benefactor has arranged for me to study mathematics and drawing. There is kindness here, books, a tutor who does not shout, and warm food. I dream now of bridges and buildings, of finding a way to create instead of escape. I do not know how you did it, but thank you. Always your brother, James." Tears welled in her eyes, quiet and clean. She pressed the letter to her chest and looked up toward the sea, where the horizon shimmered like a promise. She did not ask Sebastian how it had happened. She only kissed his cheek when they crossed paths that evening, and he nodded once, almost imperceptibly. That was enough. There was a peace between them now, a peace that needed no ceremony. They moved like the tide, sometimes side by side, sometimes apart, but always drawn back to the same shoreline. In the west wing, once blackened and sealed, the doors now stood open. Eleanor had overseen its transformation herself. What had once held soot and silence now held books, windows, and light. Shelves lined the walls, filled with volumes from the neglected library. A globe stood near the hearth, and a single armchair, worn but inviting, rested beside it. The portrait of Lady Isolde had been restored and rehung, not in the center, but above a modest writing desk surrounded by blooms. Her gaze no longer accused. It watched over the room like a memory that had been acknowledged, not buried. Sebastian stood there one evening, his silhouette framed by the tall window. Eleanor entered quietly, carrying a new volume of poetry to add to the shelf. He turned to her, not startled, but expectant. "Come see," he said. She crossed to him. Outside, the cliffside garden was beginning to bloom. Tiny snowdrops, early daffodils, even a handful of violets pushed through the soil as though determined to claim their place in the world again. "You said this place couldn't be saved," she murmured. "I was wrong," he replied. "You taught me that some things do not need to be rebuilt. They need to be reborn." She looked up at him. "And what about you?" He didn't answer with words. Instead, he removed his gloves. His hands, though still marked, no longer trembled. He reached for her, brushing the back of his fingers along her cheek with reverence and wonder. It was a simple gesture, no declaration, no demand, but in that single touch lived everything. Trust, surrender, the quiet miracle of healing. Eleanor closed her eyes, leaning into the warmth. Outside, the wind moved gently through the orchard. The trees, once bare, rustled with new buds, and the first bees had begun to hum. Inside, there were no ghosts, only the living, only the two of them, standing in a room that had once held fire and now held peace. Beneath the ashes, at last, a garden had grown. The morning dawned golden and full of promise, the kind of spring day that Cornwall had not seen in years. The cliffs, once haunted by wind and shadow, were crowned with wildflowers. Apple trees trembled with new blossoms. The sea stretched out beneath the horizon like silk, calm and vast and softly gleaming. Tregarrow Hall had awakened. The manor stood with its windows thrown open, letting in the scent of lilacs and warm bread, of grass newly cut and lemon oil on polished banisters. Laughter echoed down the corridors, not the quiet, restrained kind that had once tiptoed through its rooms, but full, bright, and unashamed. Servants moved with lightness in their steps. Children darted past the hedgerows, their shoes muddy, their faces clean. The spring festival had returned to Tregarrow for the first time in over 2 decades. The grounds had been transformed. Silk banners in shades of plum, gold, and green fluttered between the trees. Long wooden tables had been laid out beneath canopies, their tops crowded with pies, fruit preserves, and bottles of elderflower cordial. Musicians tuned their strings beneath the arbor, and the scent of roasting meat drifted from open fires beside the orchard wall. Villagers had gathered early. They came in their Sunday coats and hand-sewn bonnets, arms linked and baskets in hand. There were smiles among them, real ones. Faces once lined by hardship had softened in the months since the thaw began. They spoke not only of survival now, but of songs, of books, of school lessons and new roofs and warm cider in the winter. And they came not out of obligation, but because Tregarrow had changed. Because its master had changed, and its mistress had made it so. From the balcony overlooking the gardens, Eleanor watched the preparations unfold. Her hands rested lightly on the balustrade, her gaze following the movement of people she now knew by name, by story. She could see old Mr. Prentice helping a girl pin a daisy to her braid. She could see the orphaned boys from the school unpacking jars of jam, supervised by Mrs. Penrose, who was trying, without success, to keep her apron clean. She was dressed in a gown of sea-green silk, simple and soft, with a sash of ivory ribbon tied at her waist. Her hair, loosely swept and adorned with a single white bloom, danced with the breeze. At her throat, for the first time in weeks, there was no brooch. She was waiting. Behind her, the door to the solar opened. Sebastian stepped onto the balcony, the sunlight catching on the shoulders of his tailored coat, deep grey with fine embroidery at the cuffs. He wore no gloves. His hands, though still scarred, moved without hesitation. He walked toward her, not like a man returning from war, but like one arriving where he was always meant to be. Eleanor turned to him with a quiet smile. "They've begun setting out the ribbons," she said, glancing toward the maypole being raised near the orchard. "I saw," he replied, "and someone has painted the stones near the stream with flowers. Lydia and the Harrow girls," she said. "They did it as a surprise. They asked if they could stay past sunset. I said yes." He looked out over the gardens, his expression soft with wonder. "I've lived in this house for more than 3 decades, but it never felt like this." Eleanor's voice lowered. It was waiting. He looked at her then, truly looked, not with restraint or uncertainty, but with reverence. And so was I. She stilled as he reached into his coat pocket. From within, he withdrew something small, wrapped in a scrap of velvet. He stepped closer. "I believe," he said, "this belongs to you." Eleanor's breath caught as he unfolded the fabric. The cameo brooch, her mother's, the one she had carried with her through every silence, every wound, every night she had sat alone and refused to vanish. She had not worn it in weeks. Not since the day she told herself she no longer needed it to remember who she was, but when he lifted it and gently clasped it at the base of her throat, she realized what it meant now. Not a tether to the past, but a crown for the present. "You said you wouldn't disappear," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "And you didn't." His fingers lingered against her skin. "You rebuilt everything." She reached up and pressed her hand over his. Not alone. Below them, the music began. A soft swell of violins, followed by tambourine and flute. The villagers clapped and began to dance, laughter rising like song into the sunlight. The maypole spun in circles, its ribbons streaming behind the children as they ran in unison, weaving red and blue and gold into braids of joy. A soft wind passed through the trees. Petals rained down from above. Sebastian looked out at the scene, and his gaze grew distant. "I used to think," he said slowly, "that what had broken inside me could never be made whole. That grief was all I had left." Eleanor took his hand. "And now?" He turned to her, eyes bright. "Now, I think grief was just the soil." She felt her chest swell with something she had no name for. They stood there a moment longer, letting the sound of life carry up to meet them. Then, arm in arm, they descended the staircase and crossed the terrace. As they stepped into the garden, the villagers turned, and then, slowly, as if moved by some silent signal, they began to applaud, not with formality, but with recognition. Because Cornwall's coldest house had not only opened its doors, it had opened its heart, and in the center of it all stood a woman who had refused to disappear, and a man who had dared to feel again. They walked together toward the music. The cameo gleamed at her throat. His hand never left hers. The ice had not merely melted, it had bloomed. Cornwall, spring of the year 1829. The wind that once howled along the cliffs of Tregarrow now sighed gently through fields of wild chamomile and heather. The sea remained as it always had, eternal, untamed, but the house that watched over it had changed. Tregarrow Hall stood no longer as a fortress, but as a sanctuary. Its gardens had expanded beyond the stone wall, now spilling down the hill in terraces of roses, apple trees, and lavender. A narrow path wound through the orchard toward the schoolhouse, which had doubled in size. The once abandoned west wing had become the heart of the estate, a library filled with books, voices, and the echo of soft laughter. Inside that library, now warmed by the late afternoon sun, sat Eleanor, her dark hair streaked with the faintest touch of silver, her face still aglow with the quiet beauty of a life fully lived. She wore a gown the color of pale cream and a pendant that once belonged to her mother. On the carpet near her feet lay two children, a boy of 7 with eyes the color of winter sky, and a girl of 5 whose curls were dark and wild like the sea. They were drawing. Careful with the charcoal, Eleanor murmured with a smile, glancing down from her book. Last time your sister left handprints across 3 chapters of Milton. I'm not, said the boy, his brow furrowed in concentration. I'm drawing the cliffs. Eleanor leaned down and kissed the crown of his head. Then draw them brave, Henry. The girl looked up. Mama, is Papa home yet? Before Eleanor could answer, the door creaked open, and Sebastian stepped inside. He was broader now, with lines carved by time and laughter around his mouth. His hair, once dark as ash, had lightened at the temples, but his eyes, those storm-grey eyes, still held the fire of that night so many years ago. Papa! The children cried in unison. He crouched and opened his arms, catching them both in a tight embrace. I come bearing treasure, he said, lifting a small bundle from beneath his coat. 2 sweet buns, still warm, from cook's kitchen. Eleanor closed her book and rose, walking toward him. They met in the middle of the room. No urgency, no ceremony, just familiarity born of deep, enduring love. He touched her cheek with the same reverence as he had that day in the library, 8 years before, and then he kissed her, lightly, sweetly, before resting his forehead against hers. You look like the girl I met in the storm, he whispered. And you, she replied, like the man I waited to meet. Outside, the bells of the school rang. Children poured out into the fields, their laughter carried by the wind. Among them was James Ashcroft, now a young man of 20, tall and bright-eyed, waving to his sister from across the garden. He had become an apprentice architect in Exeter, but returned every spring to teach mathematics to the village boys. You've made this a place people return to, he had once told Eleanor. She had only smiled and said, it was never mine alone. Not far from the school stood a modest stone grave, simple and unadorned, shaded by a cherry tree. Lady Isolde Grafton, born 1793, died 1821. Struth should never burn in silence. Julian Blackthorne had not been seen since his failed sabotage. Rumours placed him in debtor's prison. Others whispered of a ship bound for South America, but no word ever came. He had vanished like the man he had always been, an echo, a shadow, a consequence. Dr. Merrick had retired and now painted watercolours by the sea. Mrs. Penrose remained sharp as ever, now teaching the girls how to lace a bodice, knead a loaf, and never bow to a man who didn't know the value of his wife. Mr. Hale, his hands bent with age, still carried a ledger wherever he went. And Tregarrow? Tregarrow lived. Its stone walls bore ivy now, not soot. Its gates stood open every Sunday. Its chapel rang with weddings and songs. Its windows glowed with lamplight, not silence. As the sun dipped lower, casting the room in amber, Sebastian gathered Eleanor in his arms and whispered, "Tell me again you'll never leave." She leaned into his chest, the scent of cedar and sea salt still clinging to him. "I won't," she said. "Not in this life, and not in the next." And in that golden hour, with their children at their feet and the sea beyond their walls, they stood, two souls forged in storm, now at peace. The ice had not only bloomed, it had endured. What if the coldest heart could learn to love? Eleanor and Sebastian's journey reminds us that even the most shattered souls can heal when touched by truth, resilience, and compassion. What began as a marriage forged in silence became a love story carved by fire, patience, and quiet courage. Their legacy at Tregarrow Hall teaches us that rebuilding doesn't happen overnight, but when it comes, it blooms. This is more than a romance. It's a reminder that no matter how dark the past, something beautiful can still grow from its ashes. That forgiveness takes strength. That love, true, lasting love, doesn't always arrive like a thunderclap. Sometimes it begins with a single gesture, a glance, a whispered promise not to disappear. If this story moved you, if it stirred something in your heart, tell us in the comments what touched you most about Eleanor's transformation or Sebastian's redemption. And if you made it to the very end of this unforgettable journey, write the word "bloomed" in the comments so we know who stayed with us all the way. Your presence means the world to us. If you'd like to support the team behind these heartfelt tales, we welcome your super thanks on YouTube with any amount you wish, big or small. Every gesture helps us keep bringing these stories to life. And if you're not able to contribute financially, we completely understand. Your support can still make a difference. Just share this story with someone you think would love it. A friend, a sister, a mother. Spread the warmth, the hope, the romance. Don't forget to check out the other period love stories we've linked in the cards. They might just steal your heart next. Thank you for being part of this journey. And remember, even the coldest winters end in spring.